So, welcome. This is the beginning of this review video. So this is Unit 3, the post-classical era, about 600 to about 1450 CE. So for this review, we're not going to go like civilization by civilization through, each like chapter in the text, but this covers chapters 7 through 12 that we've looked at in this unit. But we're going to be looking at mostly the sort of connections among different parts of the world, and especially in Afro-Eurasia, that's where we spent most of our time actually looking at. And we're going to look at sort of just how things changed or stayed the same over time during this time period. So first of all, the big trade networks that existed in Afro-Eurasia, there are a couple that were overland. So that's the Silk Road that connected East Asia to the Middle East, and that's the one that went through Central Asia here. And then you have the Trans-Sahara Trade Network that connected North Africa with West Africa, so the Kingdom of Mali down here. Then you had two maritime or like seagoing trade networks. So you've got the Mediterranean Sea, and then you've got the Indian Ocean. So basically all of these trade networks, though, regardless of which one it is, they all depended on the same sorts of things to really sort of grow, and they all resulted in a lot of the same kinds of diffusion of ideas, religions, languages, etc. So we're going to look at some more elements of interregional exchange then. And basically, like, the big sort of change that's happening during this time period is that these networks of exchange are getting wider, so they're sort of growing to incorporate more people in more places, and they're getting deeper. So the connections that existed between different regions along these trade networks are going to get more intense. There's going to be more people moving, more goods moving, more ideas and things, and so on. So now these networks of exchange grew due to a number of factors. Number one, you've got new ideas that just make it easier to actually trade and interact along these trade routes. So along the Silk Road in particular, you have caravanserai. Do you guys remember what these were? Well, caravans are large groups of people traveling together. Caravanserai were sort of like the pit stops, for those big groups of camels and or horses. So these are sort of like, inns that there would be constructed along the Silk Road where people could stop with their caravans, trade with other people who were there, take on water, etc. So it just made it easier to move through like desert and mountain areas. So the compass made it easier to travel around the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean Sea because you could know what direction you're going. The compass was invented in China, and then very quickly that idea made its way all over Afro-Eurasia. So new types of ship designs and sail designs that made it easier to go around the ocean, to go along the coast of China, to go around the Mediterranean Sea. And basically there's just kind of constant continuous improvement, just making ships better, more maneuverable, able to carry more stuff, that allows trade to happen. So things like the astrolabe. This is a navigational tool that allowed sailors to see or sort of measure where objects were in the sky relative to the horizon. And that could tell you your position north or south of the equator. So that was something that could help you get a sense of where you are on the face of the earth. And business practices, just ways of doing business, made it easier as well. So banking houses that are established all across Afro-Eurasia allow you to deposit money in one place and then take a note to another place where there's a branch of that bank and allow you to take your money out there. And the idea of credit and writing checks, basically, making it easier to move and not necessarily carry cash, which is insecure. New types of business practices just made it easier to just do business and do trade and so on. And in the Trans-Saharan network in particular, camel domestication began in about the 600s or so CE in that part of the world, and that made it possible to go across the Sahara Desert for the first time from oasis to oasis in order to exchange and trade and so on. And that's actually an example of a sort of adaptation to the environment, because nomadic peoples who lived along the edge of the desert, once they learned how to domesticate camels, that allowed them to adapt to that particular type of environment and survive a little more effectively. But other types of environmental knowledge are things like understanding how the monsoon wind patterns worked. That allowed merchants to go across the Indian Ocean more effectively and more rapidly. So basically, just understanding like how the world works and being able to adapt to it made trade more possible. So in some case, you have state efforts. So political states or governments doing things that are specifically intending to make exchange grow. So an example of this might be when the Mongols in the 1200s built caravanserai all along the Silk Road. And in the Inca Empire over in Peru, when they built road networks that made it easier to trade within the empire. And pretty much every empire that exists in Afro-Eurasia during this time will do things like building roads and just promoting trade because it's something that is just good for empires to do. It helps their people prosper, makes them more productive, and so on. And as empires got bigger and bigger, one of the reasons why empires actually bother expanding in the first place is to allow more trade to happen, to have access to more resources. So, when Islam began in the Middle East, and Arab people who were expanding an Islamic empire from the Middle East, one of the reasons they were doing that was to gain control over as much of these trade networks as they could, for the purpose of expanding trade, promoting trade, and then taxing it as well. So, questions so far? Okay. So, as exchange grows and gets deeper, this led to a bunch of things. Number one, increases in trade and exchange always means cities. More cities in more places, bigger cities, because cities are places where trade really sort of happens. So a place like Baghdad or a place like Calicut, these are areas where people from all over different parts of those regions, whether it's the Indian Ocean or the Middle East, would all come together to trade goods with each other, to buy and sell goods with each other. So cities are really kind of like the hubs of trade. So anytime trade is rising, cities are getting bigger and more important and more numerous and wealthier. And in cities that are open to trade, you tend to have diasporic communities. These are basically groups of people who live outside of their original homeland and basically settle in a new place specifically for the purpose of making a life for themselves. Now, it's not people who are going to conquer other areas, but simply going there for the purpose of having a life. So Chinese merchants, some of them ended up settling in Southeast Asia, and Indian merchants would settle in Southeast Asia. Arab merchants would settle in East Africa or in India. And basically you have these communities of people who are living in new parts of the world because that's where they wanted to go in order to do international trade. Now, religions diffuse very wisely through trade. So during this particular time period, Buddhism spread along the Silk Road. Islam spread pretty much in every single direction from the Middle East. So it spread along the Indian Ocean, spread across the Sahara, spread across the Silk Road. So this is something that kind of moves along with the merchants who are carrying the religion. So languages and writing systems will spread as well. So the language that sort of came along with Islam, Arabic, is going to spread out of the Middle East. And by the end of this time period, most of North Africa will speak Arabic. Most of the Middle East will speak Arabic. So this is going to be something that also kind of goes along with merchants who are moving and bringing their religion and bringing their languages with them too. So crops and agricultural techniques will spread, and this is something we're going to look at again a little bit later on. Now, unfortunately, as people become more sort of connected to each other, that also means the likelihood of pandemic disease becomes greater. And there's one particular disease that popped up a couple of times during this time period that we talked about. Yeah. The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, is really like the name of this particular disease. In the 1300s, that particular instance of it was the Black Death. Now, in the 500s, the bubonic plague also spread, across most of Afro-Eurasia as well. But the Black Death The bubonic plague led to serious declines in population, and that's something that does actually lead to a decline in trade as well. Because as it becomes clear that having contact with other people might increase the chances of getting this disease, you start to see that states and cities that it affects will sometimes be less, interested in continuing to do trade if that's one of the outcomes of it. So, now, so basically, though, just to illustrate this a bit, by 1450, there's a few sort of broad religious trends that are going on. So, Islam began in the Middle East, in the Arabian Peninsula, right around the city of Mecca. And that's still like the focal point of the Islamic religion. That's the place where people in Islam go on the Hajj, the pilgrimage. But over a few hundred years, Islam spread across the Middle East, into Central Asia, into North Africa, into West and East Africa through trade, along the sort of coastal areas of Southeast Asia. And Islam did arrive in India, but Hinduism is still going to be the dominant religion in this part of the world. But Islam did make its way there. Now, over here in Europe, Christianity became the dominant religion there, but there were two different branches of Christianity we talked about. But basically, by 1450, all of Europe will have become Christian, primarily through trade and missionary activity. And then over in East Asia, that's where Buddhism became really dominant. And in particular, this is Mahayana Buddhism. But it spread through the Silk Road, through China, into other parts of East Asia as well. And once again, Confucianism, the philosophy from classical China, that still remained also incredibly influential in China, but Buddhism also became popular as well. But basically, you have this kind of enormous diffusion of these particular religions into these parts of Afro-Eurasia. So, now, the migration, yes.
What is like the religion for like the
Green?
green color areas?
Oh, yeah. So, well, it's not that they're not inhabited, but basically, like, the areas that are in cream that don't have one of these colors, those are either areas where another religion already existed. So, like down here in India, even though there were Islamic rulers in northern India, most of India was still Hindu. So the people down here were still predominantly Hindu. Um, Now, down here in sub-Saharan Africa, you had people who still adhered to traditional polytheistic religions. And in particular, the Bantu migrations brought new religious ideas across sub-Saharan Africa. And basically, like, there just hadn't been penetration by other types of religions yet, by new religions into those areas. And down here in Australia, people lived there, but they just had their own traditional religion that they continued during this time period. So, does that make sense? Okay. So, now in Afro-Eurasia especially, you see a huge amount of migration and movement of people that has some significant effects, and a few particular things I want to focus on here. So we've talked about diasporic communities of merchants already. This is something that involved people leaving their original homeland and settling in a new area. So once again, there were Arab Muslim merchants who ended up all over the Indian Ocean and in West Africa. There were Indian merchants who ended up all over the Indian Ocean. There were Chinese merchants who ended up in Southeast Asia. But there's also going to be a few nomadic groups that are going to be really important during this time period, because even though they begin as sort of small groups of nomads, they are able to conquer enormous land-based empires. So a few important examples of this. So the people where Islam began, the Arabs from the Arabian Peninsula, they were pastoral nomads, and they were merchants who carried goods across the Arabian Peninsula, but basically they were people who really depended on camel domestication as the basis for their way of life in the desert. But despite the fact that they began as nomads, they were still able to conquer an enormous chunk of territory. They conquered all of the Middle East, they conquered North Africa. So the caliphates, the Islamic empires that they created, were obviously incredibly important for world history. Now, another group of people also migrated from Central Asia, during the 900s to 1200s, the Turks. And Turkic peoples, once again, began as pastoral nomads. They lived on horseback, and they were one of the groups of people from the steppe, this huge swath of territory here that really you could only live as pastoral nomads along this area. So they entered the Middle East and they became Muslim predominantly, but they were able to create pretty big empires of their own that were known as sultanates. And the word sultan just means like ruler in the Turkic languages. And the Mongols, they were kind of the ultimate, expression of this. Chinggis Khan, the first one from Mongolia among the Mongols, who once again began as sort of poor pastoral nomads, and there weren't that many of them, but they were able to create enormous empires across Afro-Eurasia because they were just so effective at military conquest and then sort of organizing the territory they ruled. Now, one other important migration of people was the Bantu migrations. And the Bantus, these were people originally from sort of West Central Africa, and over the course of the classical and then most of the post-classical, they gradually sort of spread out from there, and the culture of the Bantus, so their language, their religious ideas, their knowledge of agriculture and iron technology, became really sort of the dominant culture across most of sub-Saharan Africa. Now, later on though, as the Swahili coast here, the east coast of Africa, and then this area here along the Niger River, those areas became predominantly Muslim because they sort of took in influences from these trade routes that they were connected to. But most of sub-Saharan Africa, though, even to this day, speak Bantu languages and really sort of derive their culture from that particular culture. So, questions so far? All right. Now, a couple of other things to be aware of then. So, during this time period, pretty steadily, for almost the entire time period, the population of the world is growing. And there's a couple of moments where it declines, like the Black Death is the biggest example of this. But for the most part, the population of the world is going to grow pretty steadily. And that's because food production is growing across more of the world. And a couple of things to be aware of that allowed this to happen. Number one, the temperatures, global temperatures increased, slightly, but enough to make a difference over the course of this time period. So by the 1300s, that meant you could have more land being farmed, longer growing seasons so your crops could get bigger, and basically that's something that allowed more food to be produced. And there's all sorts of agricultural innovations that are kind of important too. Basically just new ideas people came up with that allowed them to make more food. So an example we just looked at recently was chinampas. These were the sort of like little islands of floating farmland in Mesoamerica that the Aztecs, ultimately were like the ones who were sort of the best at. But terracing, that means taking a hillside and literally just sort of carving like flat farmland into it to allow more land to be brought under cultivation. Terracing is something that's invented independently in parts of Asia, Africa, and the Americas as well. So another example of new agricultural innovations. So this word here, kanat, this was a Persian invention that eventually became widespread across the Middle East. And it's kind of an underground aqueduct that allowed people to access water that was underground and use it for agricultural purposes. And some types of crops, as they spread, became more productive as well. So in Asia, for example, what was the crop that began in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam? Rice, yes. And rice cultivation spread from Southeast Asia into China and then into other parts of East Asia as well. And as rice becomes more heavily cultivated, rice was an incredibly dense crop. Like, it's a lot of calories per acre of land that you're planting. So the more that rice cultivation spreads across Asia, the higher the population can get. What was the crop that was most important in Mesoamerica? Corn. What's another word for that? Maize. Yeah. So that was first cultivated in Mexico, Mesoamerica, and then that started to spread elsewhere in North America as well, and that allowed population to grow. But all across, the Middle East, you have things like wheat and barley, and basically just the more widespread certain types of crops become, and the more that those particular like really high yield crops are planted, the more food is going to be produced. So now some other innovations to be aware of. So things like just better iron plows that could dig into harder soil, collars that you could put around a horse so it could pull really heavy plows. These are things that just made more cultivation possible. So now besides food, you also just have more stuff, more goods being produced all across the world. And this is partly due to just the fact that the more people there are, the more tools you're going to need, the more clothing you're going to need. But also, as agriculture becomes more productive, that means there's more people who are able to not do farming and are able to devote themselves to producing goods. So you start to see then that there's more commercialization, where people in a place like China, rather than just growing food for themselves, they might start growing silk that they could sell for a profit. They might start, making tools that they can sell for a profit. So commercialization refers to this change, where more and more people start making stuff to sell rather than just making food for themselves. And, this is not something that was totally widespread, because even in China, 90% of the population were still poor farmers or peasants, but there's a little bit more commercialization happening. And as the population grows, as more goods are being produced, that means more urbanization as well, because cities will get bigger and you start to see more trade happening to kind of feed that demand. So, now luxury goods that, are worth mentioning. Things like silk are still really high value all across Afro-Eurasia, and most of that's still coming from China. What's another like luxury good that the Chinese started producing? Well, soap came from the Middle East. Satin? Oh, actually, I don't know when satin was invented. Interesting. Well, porcelain, or like China, was something that was being produced in enormous quantities in China. So let's see. Okay, now as these changes start to take place, so the way that labor is organized, some cases you start to see continuation of ways that labor is organized. In other cases, you see new ways that labor is organized. And when we say labor organization, what this means is basically like the way that societies and governments organize people for the purpose of making things and making sure that their work is being used effectively and productively. So, in most of the world, most people were peasants. So, poor farmers who either, owned a little bit of land or just worked as laborers on somebody else's land. Most people were peasants across most of the world for, almost all of the last few thousand years. So, that's still the sort of main way of life. Now, in some cases, peasants were, free. In some cases, they were, not necessarily free. And in most big empires, peasants will sometimes be forced to do labor, against their will, just because like they're so poor and sort of and lack so many rights that those above them in society will expect them to do some work. So the word corvée, this refers to any time that peasants are forced to do labor against their will, to do things like building walls or building roads, or something that they're not really sort of used to doing. So in China, for example, the Great Wall was produced primarily using corvée labor, and all across really all of Afro-Eurasia, peasants are quite often sort of forced into service to maintain irrigation systems. But now nomadic pastoralism is going to continue for this whole time period, and especially in Central Asia along the Silk Road, in the steppe, that's where you have the most nomadic pastoralists out of any part of the world. So let's see. Now, unfortunately, slavery is another method of labor organization that will continue during this time period. And slavery is probably the most common during this time period in the Middle East and some parts of Africa. But slavery is something that unfortunately will exist in pretty much every major civilization across the world at this point, to one degree or another. But in some areas like China or India, it's not really that common. But in other places, it unfortunately is more common. Now, there's also going to be new types of labor organization that occur. So, new ideas that people have in sort of how to organize people's labor for productive purposes. So, in Europe and Japan, these are two areas that become feudal societies, where there's a small group of warrior elites who own the land, and then underneath them you have a class of people known as serfs. And serfs are peasants who are not free to move elsewhere or go work on land elsewhere. If you are born a serf, then you will be a serf for your whole life. And those coming after you in future generations in your family are expected to also do labor on the same land. Now, you're not a slave. You can't be like bought or sold to other people. You're not property. But serfs are expected to just stay on the land and work that land. That's their position in society in feudal systems. So, serfdom, though, there were also sort of differences in the way that serfs particularly related to different landlords. So in some cases, serfs, would have a little bit more rights. They'd be allowed to marry who they want, have as many kids as they want. But in some cases, serfs were not free to do any of those things. They were really sort of controlled by their landlords. Now in European cities, so in Western Europe, as the population of Western Europe grew, especially after the year 1000, cities start to get bigger and bigger, and a new type of organization emerges known as guilds. These are basically people who are all in the same trade or the same business. They might be blacksmiths or bakers or masons or carpenters. And basically to protect their business interests, to make sure that they can keep their prices high, to make sure that the quality of the work being done in that business is good, they create guilds, these sort of unions where they agree on business practices, they agree on prices, and guilds became kind of like a social, a mutual aid network as well as a business organization. So they weren't like the caste system in India, because in the caste system, whatever occupation you were born into, you were expected to stay in that particular occupation for your whole life. In guilds, you could leave a guild, you could go do something else, but these became like the way that people in European cities really identified themselves. So bakers hung out with other bakers, and that was the sort of group that they were part of that gave them a sort of social identity. Now, in the Inca Empire in particular, during the 13 and 1400s in modern-day Peru and Bolivia, over in the Andes Mountains, there was another type of forced labor called mita. And this particular type of forced labor, once again, the people in the Inca Empire weren't slaves, but every so often a certain amount of people from each village or family would be basically drafted to go and maintain the roads in the Inca Empire, or maintain irrigation systems, or help build a warehouse where the government would keep grain supplies or something. So this kind of labor draft was known as mita. All right, now moving along. So besides those changes in the way that labor was organized, you also have some big religious changes happening during this time period. Number one, probably the most significant religious change that occurs, is that Islam begins. So Islam is going to start in the early 600s CE around the city of Mecca in the Arabian Peninsula. And the prophet who founded this religion, who began preaching these new religious ideas, was Muhammad. He was a pastoral nomad. He was a merchant, and basically, this was a very strict monotheistic religion. You simply could not worship anything besides the one single God, known as Allah. And Islam, it became a religion that became very popular very quickly because it was a relatively straightforward religious message. Worship the one God, accept Muhammad's messages from the one God, and just do the things that are expected of a good Muslim, and you're a good Muslim. So, Islam then spread really quickly throughout the Arabian Peninsula and then across North Africa, Central Asia, and it's something that became, probably the most popular religion across Afro-Eurasia by the 1400s. So, now what is the name for the five basic expectations or sort of basic practices and beliefs? Yes. The five pillars, yes, of Islam. Now, one of them, of course, was the Hajj, or the pilgrimage to the city of Mecca, which all Muslims were expected to do once in their life if they were able to afford it and if they were physically capable of doing it. But also just accepting the one God as the only God was, another one of the pillars. Giving charity to the poor to support the community, fasting during the holy month of Ramadan, and then praying 5 times a day to the one God. And these were meant to be, not just like things that you would do, but ways to sort of bind people in the Islamic community together. And as Islam spread and became more diverse, and you had Arabs, and you had Europeans, and you had Central Asians, and Indian people, and Persians all becoming Muslim, the five pillars were something that sort of brought them all together across these cultural differences. So that was something that really sort of unified Islam, even as it became more sort of widespread and diverse. And the word for the whole sort of world of Islam, where as Islam spreads and kind of crosses, boundaries of civilizations and cultures, there was this sense that all Muslims, no matter like what background they were from or what part of the world they were from, they were all part of something. And the something that they started to call themselves was Dar al-Islam, the house of Islam. Everywhere that Islam was within the house of Islam. Now, unfortunately, though, there are going to be some divisions that occur. And in Islam, there's going to be a schism between Sunni Muslims and Shia Muslims. And this was over the issue of who should become the leader of Islam after Muhammad, and what exactly the role of that leader should be. So the word for the leader of Islam, the successor to Muhammad, was the Caliph or the Caliph. So Sunni Muslims wanted it to be just the best leader from among the Muslim community. Shia Muslims wanted it to be someone who was related to Muhammad, who had the same sort of spiritual development as Muhammad. So Sunni Muslims, though, have become more numerous than Shia Muslims. So in East Asia, Buddhism is going to spread into China during the Tang Dynasty, like the 600s and 700s, and become really popular. And even though eventually Chinese dynasties will stop supporting it openly and stop like building monasteries, it's still going to remain a really popular and influential religion just among the people of China. So, and then from China, Buddhism is going to spread into Korea, into Japan, into Vietnam, and basically will become, a hugely influential religion across all of East Asia. Then, in Europe, as Christianity becomes more widespread across Europe, it's also going to split. There's going to be a schism. So in Western Europe, in places like Italy, France, England, Spain, the type of Christianity there is known as the Roman Catholic Church. And the leader of that particular religious organization is the Pope, sitting in Rome. But over in the East, around the Byzantine Empire and Russia, that's where you have Eastern Orthodox Christianity, where the church isn't really independent. It's basically under the control of kings and rulers in that eastern part of Christendom. But basically, though, Christianity does become the religion of pretty much all of Europe by the end of this time period. Now, religion will spread during this time period constantly. Sometimes it's through conquest. So as Islam spreads, or as Arab Muslims conquer the Middle East, as they conquered Persia, as they conquered North Africa, they brought their religion with them. Merchants are usually a way that religions diffuse. So Islamic merchants will go across the Sahara and bring religion or bring Islam to West Africa. Islamic merchants will bring that religion to East Africa. They'll bring that religion to India and Southeast Asia. And Buddhist merchants, even before Islam, were one of the ways that Buddhism came to East Asia. So missionaries as well are going to be one of the main ways that religions spread. So missionaries are people who move specifically for the purpose of spreading their religious idea. So monks in Buddhism and Christianity are going to be important ways that those particular religions spread. And in Islam, there was a group known as Sufis. Now, Sufis are not monks, but it's kind of the closest thing to monks in Islam. So these are people who were mystics, who rather than focusing on like reading the Quran and performing Islamic rituals in just the right way, their goal was to have kind of like a mystical spiritual connection to God. And Sufi practices then were kind of more adaptable to some parts of the world. So people who didn't necessarily know how to read Arabic and couldn't read the Quran could still sort of become Muslim by doing Sufi practices, by doing meditation or special types of dances or chants and so on. Yes? Hmm? Oh, okay. Another like 10 minutes maybe. So, all right. Now, in some ways, or in some cases, these religious changes have a big impact on the particular opportunities and rights available to women in different societies. So in Islam, the Quran, the basic scripture of Islam, did have some specific protections for women and did give some specific rights to women. So in Islam, women were allowed to own property. It was easier to get a divorce than it had ever been before in the Middle East. So basically, as more cultures adopted Islam, in some ways, women actually gained more rights in the process. Now, there were some restrictions, though. So it was still more difficult for women to get divorces than for men. And it was possible for men to, marry up to 4 women, but women could only have one husband. So there were just more restrictions on women compared to men, but there were some changes in the opportunities they had as well. In Christianity and Buddhism, monasteries gave women a place they could go that was kind of separate from the normal expectations of their societies. So in parts of Europe and East Asia, societies that, like most early societies were somewhat patriarchal, it was possible for a woman to become a nun, to go join a monastery, and then be kind of independent. She could learn to read. She could, practice religion on her own. She could be with other like-minded women, and it kind of took them away from some of the more oppressive expectations that there might have been. Now, unfortunately, though, there are also ways that religion, in some cases, did sort of lead to more restrictions on women. So in China during the Song dynasty, so after the year 1000, as Confucianism became more and more intense, you could say, and as kind of a reaction to some of the rights that Buddhism had allowed for women, in Song dynasty China, elite women started to be expected to bind their feet. So that's the practice of well, we saw the pictures of it, where their feet would be sort of, broken. So as they grew, their feet would remain really small, making them really kind of dependent on other people to help them literally walk around, and obviously limited their ability to work or sort of be really sort of physically active. So now, last couple things we're going to get to here are political systems and empires. So the empires that we talked about in the post-classical era and the civilizations we talked about, basically empires during this time period are going to do a lot of the things that previous empires had done. So all of the empire building methods and state building methods that we talked about when we dealt with the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty back in the classical era and the Persian Empire, empires during this time period are going to basically do a lot of the same things. They're all going to claim divine right to rule. So in China, dynasties there will keep claiming the mandate of heaven, that, heaven has placed the emperor on the throne to take care of the Chinese people. In the Byzantine Empire, the emperors there will claim to rule on behalf of Jesus and God. So this idea of divine right to rule is always going to be a central part of empires and the way that they sort of justify their rule. Now, in pretty much every major civilization, there will be patriarchal gender roles. Men are usually the ones in positions of power and authority, economically and politically. Now, there are some exceptions to this, like we talked about the Byzantine Emperor Justinian and his wife Theodora, who kind of like ruled the empire alongside him. And in parts of sub-Saharan Africa, women will have a great deal of political power in places like Nubia and West Africa. But for the most part, though, power is still going to be really sort of under the control of men in most of the societies that we've talked about. Centralized bureaucratic governments. So especially in China, the idea of having the emperor with a sort of big organization of officials working for him to carry out his will, that becomes, once again, a really common just way of organizing an empire. But at the same time, most of the empires that we look at allow a lot of just local traditions to continue. Because if you are just one group of people conquering many other groups of people, it's really going to be impossible to make everyone just like you. And it's easier to just kind of let them do their thing as long as they remain part of the empire. So the Islamic caliphates and the Mongol khanates will quite often allow people to maintain their local cultures, even as they're becoming part of a bigger political system. And once again, promotion of trade and production, so building roads, building caravanserai, minting coins to make it easier to have money and do business. Now, some old classical empires are going to be reconstituted and continued. So the Byzantine Empire, remember, this empire, which was based around the city of Constantinople, this is basically just like continuing the Roman Empire from the classical era. So the Roman Empire back around the 1st century CE had controlled the entire Mediterranean, but the western part of the empire had collapsed, and Germanic peoples had taken over Western Europe and created their own little kingdoms. But the eastern part of the empire just kept on going. So they kept on being Roman and doing Roman things. They had a Roman-style government. They still wore Roman-style clothes. They continued doing Roman and Greek philosophy and art and so on. So they just kept on being Roman. And in China, the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties, they continued the kind of system that the Han dynasty had created, with the Confucian exams and Confucian philosophy as the basis for their government. So with, a powerful centralized government under the emperor and then his whole bureaucracy under him. So this just became sort of the way of creating empires in China during this time period as well. Now, some new types of political systems did emerge, though. So Islam, along with being a religion, became the basis for an empire. And when Islam was beginning, for the first few centuries, as it spread from Mecca outward through the Middle East into Central Asia and across North Africa, for a few hundred years, all of that was part of one giant empire ruled by the caliph, which was known as the caliphate. And the caliphate, it was a big empire with a central authority sitting in the capital as the caliph or the caliph, but it was something new. It was based on a new religion that had never existed before. And the system of law that the caliphs were claiming to uphold was Islamic law, or Sharia, based on the Quran. So, now, Turkic peoples, though, who conquered parts of the Middle East, they created their own new little Islamic kingdoms called sultanates. So even as the caliphate starts kind of falling apart and getting conquered by other people, Islam will still be the basis of the culture for these new kingdoms. Now the Mongols, whoops, there we go. So the Mongols, the system they created was also something kind of new, and partly because it was so enormous that they kind of needed to organize it in an innovative way. So the Khanates were each ruled by one of Chinggis Khan's sons or grandsons, and they all, when the Mongol Empire was at its height, were all loyal to the Great Khan back in Mongolia. But eventually, though, each of these Khanates kind of separated into their own thing. But for a time, though, it was kind of a mix between a centralized empire and something that was decentralized too. Now, city-states, like independent cities, become more common during this time period. So the places where that was happening were in like Italy, because of trade across the Mediterranean. Italian cities became really powerful and independent. In Maya civilization in Mesoamerica, you had independent city-states there. Along the Swahili coast, the east coast of Africa, the major trading cities in East Africa became independent because of the wealth that they were generating from trade. They could defend themselves and remain politically separate from other parts of Africa. Now in Europe and Japan, you have feudal societies developing. And these are systems like we talked about, where there's a small warrior elite class. People who have military power and resources, and through that are able to control land. And then the greater number of people, though, are going to be peasants or serfs who are basically stuck working on that land to support their feudal lords. And usually they'll have to pay rent for their land. They're expected to do work for their lord. But there is a sort of group of warrior elites who actually own the land. And these feudal societies, they usually were entirely agricultural. So if you were a landlord in a feudal society, this particular class of people wouldn't necessarily be quite so interested in like building big cities, rather than just owning the land and then extracting the wealth from that through the labor of their peasants. So over in the Americas, in the 1400s, this is when the two greatest empires of the Americas had emerged. The Aztec Empire in Mesoamerica, and then the Inca Empire in the Andes Mountains. Now, one of the more important things to be aware of then regarding like new states and new political systems that emerge is that there's going to be a huge amount of influence that older civilizations will have on new societies or cultures or empires that are emerging. So some states absorbed foreign traditions as they were growing, partly because, hey, like if this worked for those people, then why don't we just do it too? So a few specific examples of this to be aware of. The first civilization in what is now Russia, in Eastern Europe, were known as the Kievan Rus. And this particular civilization, as they started to emerge and grow, they were heavily influenced by the Byzantine Empire. So they became Orthodox Christians. Their first writing system was based on the Byzantine writing system. And basically they sort of patterned themselves and modeled themselves on Byzantine society because they looked at that as this kind of older, bigger, successful civilization that they could emulate. Now, in Islamic civilization, Persia, in modern-day Iran, was already a really old, sophisticated, very developed civilization. So as Islam expanded, rather than Persians becoming Arab and speaking Arabic, instead Persia basically stayed Persian even after they converted to Islam. And they kept producing the same types of art. So all those paintings I showed you with like, the guys whose heads were on fire because they were so holy, that was a very uniquely Persian style of art that they just kept on doing because it worked for them for so long and they felt no reason to like really change what they were doing. So now in East Asia, China began the tributary system where other societies around them were expected to pay tribute to basically acknowledge the supremacy of China in exchange for trade and access to Chinese culture. So through this system, elites in Korea, Vietnam, Japan, and the steppe nomads in places like Mongolia were heavily influenced by Chinese culture. They started using Chinese writing systems. They adopted Buddhism. They adopted some Confucian ideas as well. And this became, kind of like, you know, well, along with their own unique cultures, they really became sort of like smaller versions of Chinese civilization. But China itself was heavily influenced by Buddhism, and especially like during the Tang Dynasty in the early part of this time period, as Buddhism came into China, women started to gain more rights and opportunities for a very brief time, and it just became a very popular religion in China. And then finally, in Africa, West Africa and East Africa, Islam became extremely influential in those particular parts of Africa, and it was really introduced there through trade and merchant activity. So, any questions? Thank you for coming. Okay, so this is, a lot of the stuff that might appear on this exam, but make sure you look over the study guide and go through the essential questions, chapter by chapter, and
The study guide's on Schoology, right?
yeah, the study guide is on Schoology, and in class tomorrow I'm going to give you a copy of it as well. All right.